Good morning, everyone. This is Debbie Hart. I'm the President and CEO of BioNJ, and I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today for our Legal Compliance and Regulatory Forum. I hope that everyone is safe and well. So we are excited to have a very knowledgeable group of experts with us this morning, and they're going to discuss strategic communications in the midst of a crisis, legal considerations, and beyond. And as we know, when crisis hits, companies need to communicate and report both the good and the bad to their stakeholders. This morning, we're going to hear from industry securities and legal counsel, as well as communications experts on what to communicate, when to communicate, and how to communicate. When it comes to regulators, investors, board members, lenders, insurers, collaborative partners, employees, and others. Before we get started, I'd like to give a heartfelt thank you to our Legal Compliance and Regulatory Committee for putting today's forum together, realizing how busy each and every one of you are at this critical time. For those on the line, today's program does qualify for CLE credit. You'll be required to respond to questions periodically throughout the webinar to qualify. Please make sure that you're in the window mode found under the View tab to see the polling tool. Just a little housekeeping. This is a listen-only webinar. We encourage you to submit questions via the dialog box on your computer screen. We have a sized group on the line, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible at the end of the presentations. If we don't get to your question, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce two longtime BioNJ members, colleagues, and friends. Not only did they lead the development of today's discussion, they support BioNJ in numerous ways throughout the year. I'd like to welcome to moderate our program, shareholder co-chair of the FDA Biotech section for Buchanan, Ingersoll and Rooney, PC, Linda Passat-Rieg, and Vice President of North America General Medicine and Established Products, U.S. Advertising and Promotion, Global Regulatory Affairs for Sanofi, Mark Gatos. Good morning. Linda and Mark, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Debbie, very much. And just to note that if we agree for this session, this particular program, I'll be taking the lead on the moderation of the session. But we will be joined by my co-chair, Linda Rieg, at the end to wrap up and put a final summary on this session. First of all, before we launch into the program, I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you for your attendance. And briefly, I'd ask that our panelists please provide just a short bio. If we can start with John.
Sure, thanks, Mark. First, I just want to thank BioNJ for inviting me, for focusing attention on the subject of crisis readiness, and for acknowledging that COVID-19 is not the only crisis companies need to be thinking about and preparing for right now. Just by way of background, I've spent about the last 30 years helping organizations of all kinds understand and manage reputation risks, navigate fast-moving crisis situations, and restore reputation and trust lost to crises of pretty much every description. In the life sciences and biotech arena, that includes everything from product issues, safety issues and recalls, product liability litigation, government investigations into pricing, marketing practices, research conflicts, securities fraud and insider trading, to whistleblower suits, Me Too, malfeasance, intellectual property disputes, manufacturing and supply chain breakdowns, activist attacks, and it goes without saying, pandemics. We're here primarily to talk about successfully navigating crises that have heavy legal and regulatory components, which of course in life sciences means every crisis. So what I hope to share, I think you'll find applicable to virtually any crisis scenario your organization is likely to encounter. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Avram?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, BioNJ, for inviting me to speak on this panel today. As Mark mentioned, my name is Avram Adler. I'm Executive Director and Associate General Counsel at PTC Therapeutics, a NASDAQ-listed biopharmaceutical company operating here in New Jersey. At PTC, I oversee our SEC reporting and corporate governance functions, while working closely with the management team and our IR and communications teams when dealing with the issues that arise similar to the ones we'll be discussing today. And I look forward to giving some insight from the legal perspective, especially one in my role. So let me pass the mic now to my colleague at PTC, Don Mankoff.
Thanks, Avram and Mark, BioNJ, and the audience. We're really pleased to be here with you today. My name is Don Mankoff. I'm VP of Legal at PTC, a colleague of Avram's. I've been with PTC for 15 plus years as we moved from a research to clinical to a commercial stage company with operations originally just in New Jersey, now to countries worldwide. I've supported various functions at PTC through the kind of ups and downs of biotech, which we've had, like so many of the companies in our industry. And I'm now supporting the G&A, the clinical and the non-clinical functions at PTC. And I'm really thrilled to take the audience through our hypothetical and talk about how we would deal with this crisis.
Great, thank you, Don, Avram, and John, for your short bios. Before we launch into our scenario, I would like to just walk through a little bit of the content we'll cover today. We will present a scenario, and the team has done a wonderful job of preparing a very realistic scenario, multifaceted, various nuances involved, as we know most crises have, and that will be discussed in some detail by the panel. As a reminder, and Debbie mentioned this earlier, there will be a series of polling questions throughout the program, and as part of the CLE offering, it is required that you complete those. And to do so, please be sure that in the GoToMeeting you have selected the Windows mode rather than the full screen mode. As I mentioned earlier as well, Linda will then wrap up the session towards the end, and we will have time for Q&A. That is our plan. You don't have to wait until the end to submit questions. Those can be submitted throughout the meeting, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can. So without further delay, let's advance to the scenario and begin looking at that. So in this scenario, tackling rare upper body lesions, otherwise known as Trouble, is a publicly traded U.S. company with operations in the U.S. and Europe. Trouble owns a commercial stage product for head and neck cancers. Next bullet, please. On May 1st, 2020, Trouble learned that a routine EMA inspection of its primary contract manufacturer in Asia detected potential safety issue with Trouble's head and neck cancer drug product and other companies' product produced in the same facility. Next bullet, please. Initial reports suggested that the manufacturer will be shut down for at least 8 weeks. Next, please. And that Trouble believes there are 6 months supply of finished product in the plant and 3 months supply of safe finished product already in the distribution chain based on current sales. So I'll pause there and ask John and Avram to weigh in on a question. As Trouble's general counsel, investor relations director, or crisis communications advisor, with these facts before you, what is your next move? What questions would you ask, and what needs to happen? John?
My next move as the crisis and reputation risk advisor depends on several things. First is the timing, whether it's Sunday of Memorial Day weekend and we're speaking for the first time, in which case I'm going to have a long list of very pointed and probably uncomfortable questions, or whether we've worked together to prepare the company to deal with the very real, very likely possibility of a product safety issue and manufacturing outage at some point somewhere in the world. Pharmaceutical and life sciences companies, I'm preaching to the choir here, are bound by a complex set of regulatory, business, moral, and ethical responsibilities. And with those responsibilities come a broad array of risks that at some time, some place, in some way, something is going to happen that puts your operations, your stock price, and the trust of patients, physicians, investors, and everyone else who ultimately holds sway over your reputation and business in jeopardy. The most important asset in a crisis is reliable information. So my primary role at the outset is to help the company make sense of what's happening, to ask the right questions, to formulate an immediate game plan that allows it to get ahead of and take control of the situation rather than be passive and be controlled by it. So, right off the bat, I'm going to want to know, what do we know with 100% certainty? What are we certain of? What do we think we know that we need still to confirm? What don't we know that we need to know to make sound decisions? And who already knows what's happening? Who needs to know right now? And who is going to need to know at some point, and who's going to tell them? Now, if the company has had the foresight to do a crisis risk assessment and scenario planning, this is probably the most common scenario we work with biotech and pharma and life sciences companies. If you've done that, you've already had you already have a list of questions that you need answers to. People have been designated to find the answers and feed them up the chain. And everyone knows what their roles and responsibilities are, starting with making sure that everyone has the best information available to make decisions under stress. In a crisis, stress and emotion are the enemies. Stress makes you stupid. If the crisis is already happening and you're only just sitting down to figure out what you need to know and where that information resides, you're going to miss something very important. And you're going to be falling behind the narrative at the very point in the crisis when you need to be getting out in front of it. One other thing I'm looking for right from the start is that the company's legal and communications experts both need to be at the table from the outset, and both need to have equal standing in the discussions. There are inherent tensions between the legal and communications function in times of crisis. As a species, lawyers tend to default to wanting to say as little as possible, since from a legal and regulatory perspective, remaining quiet is often the path of lowest risk. But from a reputation standpoint, saying no comment or we're unable to discuss pending legal matters or words to that effect is effectively an admission of guilt. More importantly, though, not communicating puts you at greater risk in many cases, because you're handing control of the narrative to others. So it's essential over the course of the crisis to keep the organization's legal and reputation priorities in the proper balance. And that balance is dynamic. It's going to shift. There are going to be times when the company needs to be more disclosive, and there are going to be other times when the best strategy, both legally and reputationally, is to hold back. So, forming effective, close, collaborative relationships based on mutual understanding of each other's priorities between the communications team and the legal team up front, well before you have to turn the lights on in the war room and deal with a crisis, is vital, and it's incredibly valuable.
Thanks, John and Abby.
Yes, so looking at it from the legal view, especially one who handles SEC reporting and disclosures, so similar to what John discussed, when you get that call that there is an issue, the first thing you need to do is gather all of the relevant information. What is the issue at hand? What department is it in? What are the specific facts? How does it affect the company short-term and long-term? Really everything you need to know to before you even can discuss what the disclosure is going to be. Make sure that you have all the information for that disclosure and all the relevant information for when that disclosure needs to go out. Once you have all the relevant facts, you need to look at, is this issue, or will the outcome of this issue be material to the company overall? Is it, and therefore something that needs to be disclosed in the first place? Very often there are times where people, especially without the necessary legal background, thinks that something is an issue or a crisis, and it may be in sort of their world or in a specific realm, but not something from a legal standpoint that needs to be disclosed, putting reputational aspects aside. So in this scenario, for instance, one of the questions to be asked is, Well, how many marketed products does Trouble have? Is this the only one, or are there multiple products? In this scenario, if Trouble would have multiple products, the reputational risk and the disclosure of one in manufacturing issue for one of their maybe multiple products is not as material as if Trouble would only have one product. If there's only one product, the materiality skyrocketed. But even then, now that we find out that there's only one product, there are other questions. Well, how will this manufacturing issue disrupt delivering product to patients? Will this impact revenues? In the scenario, we determined that there's still product availability in the supply chain and in distribution chain looking up to 9 months. So maybe there's no immediate issue for disrupting the product and the delivery of product to patients. But the questions will arise, well, it says that there is about an 8-week lag for this issue to be fixed. So once manufacturing is up and running again, what does restocking all the backup look like? Will there be an issue in disruption in supply chain in about 5 months from now, 9 months from now? How long will it take to restock everything properly? And this might be more of a long-term issue than a short-term issue, but maybe there's still time for disclosures that doesn't need to be immediate, but will be done so in a little bit of time. Hopefully, Trouble and all your companies as well have established a disclosure committee, one made up of your CEO, your CFO, your chief operating officer, members of your legal, IR, and communications teams to discuss these questions and review the facts and determine the materiality and when and how this will need to be disclosed. In this case, you will also want to include your head of the relevant department dealing with this crisis or issue. In this case, probably your head of CMC, head of regulatory, to weigh in and give their facts and understandings. And there are other questions that you're going to want to determine upfront or in this process. Will the regulatory agency, or in this case, the manufacturer, or if there are other companies that are also being disrupted from this manufacturers, will any of them be putting out a communications, or will information be publicly available that's going to focus you in the spotlight that you're going to have to respond to? Does this issue relate to a previous disclosure that you've previously put out on one of your SEC filings? And therefore, maybe the issue itself doesn't need to be disclosed, but there's going to have to be an update to something else that you have disclosed. Maybe there's no issue directly, immediately due to the manufacturing about how supply chain will reach out, but maybe you've recently disclosed that you're going to ramp up and you're going to double the input, and now that's going to go down to 0. So you have to look at each of your recent disclosures to see how the issue fits in. And lastly, obviously decide how does it affect, or when will disclosure be put out? In this scenario, it's very possible that no disclosure will need to be put out immediately if it's not being disclosed by somebody else, or if there's not immediate materiality, and maybe something that you'll update in your upcoming quarterly reports, as opposed to putting out an 8K or even a press release immediately if it's something that's really not as material as you thought originally.
Great, thank you, John and Avram. Very, very good insight. Now we're actually going to proceed to our first polling question, so if we can bring that up. And just a reminder, completion and response to these questions is a requirement for CLE credit, and we'll have 20 seconds to respond, and then we will look at the results. So please weigh in on this question. Does your company have a crisis plan in place? And don't worry, these will not be shared, your responses. Please respond. Take another 5 seconds. Okay, let's bring up the results, please. Well, the good news is just about 2/3 have a crisis plan in place. A small percentage don't, so that's probably a good thing to get started on after this session, and a little less than 1/3 don't know, so it's again another item to follow up on. I think John highlighted the importance of having that in place and not waiting for the crisis to happen to have that in place. So let's move back to our scenario if we can. Great. And we'll go to the next bullet, please. So you see here that Trouble notifies the FDA upon hearing of this information, which the agency then requests an immediate recall covering all product manufactured since November 1st, 2019. So clearly the contact with FDA has been made. And it's important to remember this product is not only marketed in the US, this product is marketed in the EU. So it's not just the FDA that has to be brought in. And just to remind everyone, these are my opinions and should not be attributed to my employer. My comments on FDA and EMA interactions. It's an important point to make sure that there's coordinated communication with these health authorities. So in this case, we learned that FDA has been notified. It's probably important that the EMA is notified and any other relevant health authority, and that they're not learning through some other means, especially not hearing from one another, that the FDA is informing the EMA that this has happened. That really should be coordinated by the company. And in both scenarios, with the recall, the company Trouble in this case is going to want to demonstrate that they're acting upon this and executing this recall diligently and promptly and effectively, ultimately, in the interest of patients and obviously to satisfy the regulatory requirements. Might there be situations where one health authority is requesting something different and there's not alignment? Possible. Not every health authority sees each issue identically. And I think that's important for the company, in this case Trouble, to work with those health authorities to try to come up with a harmonized approach to how this crisis is handled. It could be quite problematic to have a different response in different regions to the same issue. Maybe I'll turn it over to Don now, moving away from the FDA, and maybe talk a little bit more about state requirements. Don?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, appreciate that discussion of regulation at the federal level and even in Europe. You know, companies like Trouble may have state pharmacy and distribution licenses in states which are required, which, you know, these days my understanding is roughly half. They may also have other, you know, if you think about, you know, our industry, right? Complex business, lots of potential local licensing, permitting that comes up, right? And many of those types of licensing situations require completion of applications on an annual basis, other certifications or disclosures. So you need to think about whether those types of applications, what they ask. Do they ask, you know, has there been a violation of law? Do they ask, have there been recalls? If they ask if there's a violation of law, then you may have a closer question here. Do those applications, which are often certified by key officers of the company, do they require continuous updating, or is it enough to leave them alone until the next year? And what if the requirements are different? Say in the case of these state pharma distribution licenses, state by state, are you going to have a harmonized approach across the states, or are you going to approach each one differently? You also, when you're thinking about, you know, regulators at the state level or other regulators or permit authorities, you know, if you can find out what their record is on these types of, you know, what's their record, what's their practice in terms of taking action or not? Are they very check the box oriented? They'll get your notice and stick it in a file. Are they very strict? Do they like to make examples of a biotech pharma and say, this is an opportunity for us to withdraw a license or issue a press release on how tough we're going to be as a state regulator? So if you can anticipate potential negative responses and mitigate against them, you know, using local advisors or other advisors who have, you know, better visibility into those regulators, that's something to try to think about. And third, I'll say, you know, in interacting with these types of regulators, you want to maybe try to, while staying consistent with your larger messaging, think about what they are likely to care about and tailor or emphasize your messages accordingly. Make yourself available, right? So that if they do have questions or concerns, they can come to you rather than take formal action first. And, you know, don't appear to be hiding anything or hiding yourself in terms of giving them access, because obviously you'd rather get an angry call on the phone than a formal regulatory action. Thanks, Mark.
Great. Thanks, Don. And just returning to the theme of the FDA recall that Trouble has now been asked to execute, I'd like to turn to Avram and John and weigh on what changes from an SEC disclosure perspective and an overall communications perspective might be advisable at this time. So perhaps Abraham, you can weigh in on the SEC implications.
Sure, thanks, Mark. So, clearly the scenario has definitely gotten worse with the recall, but the steps that you looking into this from a legal counsel will want to take really remain the same. The first question is, again, what are all the relevant facts? And now what are these new facts or this new issue that's come up? How does that affect everything else that you may have already discussed? And again, is this material is going to be a very important and relevant question. Definitely an FDA recall and losing your ability to deliver a product to patients immediately and not only maybe in a few months down the road is definitely much more material. But even for a one product company, there like Trouble, there are further questions that you will need to look at, and they're not always so easy. So these are things that you might always remember. In this scenario, most likely, if you have an FDA recall, you'll probably have a recall on the EMA side as well. But if you change some of the facts a little bit on this scenario, there are times where maybe you'll have a problem with the distribution in America, in the US under the FDA, but in Europe, you won't have an issue delivering product. And then your question is, well, what is the break? You need to ask, what is the breakdown of sales in general in US for Europe? And would the impact from losing the distribution in one as opposed to the other countries, how would that materially affect your bottom line revenue? What if you've never really disclosed a country by country sales report and you just give one general revenue number? This may also affect, because now you're sort of giving insight into how one country, or updating if one country is losing out on the revenues for a significant amount of time. And these are things you're gonna have to think about from a reputational risk, from sort of how the insides of your company are working, not only now, but going forward. And you're giving sometimes, and have to think about even what besides what you're messaging in the crisis, but what else are you messaging underlying that crisis in the background that maybe now investors and stockholders and analysts and all these other external individuals are now learning about your company that you didn't even mean to sort of disclose. So even if there's no materiality, and let's say this wasn't a material issue for whatever reason, but since the Trouble is a US-based company, the FDA recall will definitely cause a company perception issue, just for the fact that you're in the US, the FDA is in the US, and there's an outlook out there that's saying your product is not as safe or is not as effective or whatever the issue might be as you may have thought. And that is definitely something you're gonna wanna discuss and you're gonna put out a press release about. And even then, maybe it's not material from a legal perspective, but you want to need to focus on how the legal issue will look. Maybe there'll be an issue further down the road just from the fact that you're putting out a press release now. In other similar scenarios and situations, there's always a concern that the word of the issue may get out to the public before the company has fully put together their press release. You could definitely see similar scenarios where the FDA is putting out a ruling and maybe putting out or wants to put out the issue in a certain time frame, and you'll need to get out there before they do. If you're publicly traded and this is coming out, or this issue might be coming out at 1 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of the trading day, one of your first calls may need to be to NASDAQ to discuss whether or not you need to halt your trading. And if that's to give you enough time to prepare the press release so all the investors can sort of see everything together. And that's something that's, it's a real major decision that you and your management will have to discuss. When you're planning your disclosures, besides disclosing the issue, you should also be giving preliminary thoughts and guidance out in your disclosure about what steps will the company be taking to rectify the issue. Hopefully you've discussed with the various regulatory agencies and internally, what are the steps you'll be taking in the coming weeks and months to get everything back on track. Because investors and shareholders and all of your external counterparts are going to want to sort of see what are the steps you're taking. And you're going to be measured in a few months about what you disclose now. Now is also the time to be notifying your board if you haven't done so already, calling them a board meeting to make sure that they are aligned and agree on the messaging and the proposed plan. Let them see a copy of the press release and put in their input. Oftentimes, your board is going to be made up of industry experts, of people who have been in these crises and have faced these issues in their own companies in recently or in the past. and they will have a good sense to give advice and of what, do's and don'ts and other mind pits that you're going to want to avoid. And lastly, this is also the time to be getting your outside counsel involved, having them review the various communications and disclosures, even if they're usually not relied on to do so. Now is really the time to make sure before you get that first disclosure out that every arm that you have available that would give good insight is the time to get them to giving their insight now. Once that disclosure goes out or that information goes out, it's oftentimes too late.
Thank you, Avram. John, maybe you can then shift over and tell us a little bit about how Trouble might handle immediate inquiries or other outside stakeholders or forces that might impact their disclosure schedule.
Yeah, I mean, just a few issues on both timing and substance. First, as Avram alluded, the timing of your disclosure and the timing of when something triggers materiality is very often entirely dictated by others, not by you. The escalation trigger can be a tweet. It can be a call from a journalist who's been tipped off. It could be a social media post. In the past, we had the luxury of being able to time things, time announcements, time releases to coincide with news deadlines, which bought us some time. In the age of social media, the deadline is every minute, literally. We no longer have that luxury of time. To touch on something that Avram talked about, and that is the fact that in disclosing, in communicating, you can very easily inadvertently trigger other unintended issues or crises that don't need to be that don't need to exist. You don't want to do anything without thinking it through that could potentially create a crisis that doesn't need to happen. So, going into journalism and corporate communications rather than becoming a physician or a lawyer made me a terrible disappointment to my late Jewish mother, but at least I get to practice in my practice the Hippocratic Oath, which is first do no harm. Very often what I'm doing at the outset of a crisis is level setting with the organization to help them recognize what is and is not a crisis. Because very often, I walk into a conference room or a boardroom and everyone is convinced they have a crisis on their hands. And a lot of times I'm able to de-escalate that and say, no, you have an issue that needs to be managed. You don't yet have a crisis. Here are the things that can make it into a crisis. Now let's build into our plan how to avoid those things. So let's not create a crisis for ourselves that is unnecessary. And finally, just to go back to something Mark said earlier about achieving regulatory harmony, nothing eases your relationships with regulators, especially during a crisis, than showing that you're confident that you have the situation in hand, that you're prepared for it, and that you know what is important to them as regulators. The last thing regulators want is to be surprised, and for that surprise to reflect badly on their oversight. So the more comfortable you can make them that you know what you're doing, that you're speaking with one voice as a company, the more latitude they're going to give you. As soon as they sense that you're making things up on the fly, that there are critical questions you're not able to answer, that you haven't thought through the implications for them and for you and for the market of what you're proposing to do, they're going to naturally start to exert much more control and start to dictate rather than collaborate. And that's a slippery slope you don't want to find yourself on. So this is another reason why getting ahead of potential problems and establishing good working relationships with your key regulators before you ever need to go to them with a problem are so important.
Great, thank you, John. And perhaps we can keep you in the hot seat and return to a theme that you raised earlier. And I'd ask how the crisis plan you referred to earlier might help a company like Trouble in this situation.
Sure. a crisis plan is not a panacea, and sadly, organizations tend to look at them as such. You know, I hear all the time, well, we have a crisis plan, it's up on the shelf, it's that big red ring binder up there, and we have a crisis plan, so we're safe, we're never going to have a crisis. You know, faulty thinking. The crisis plan is an operational document that gives you a running head start at a crisis. So when something happens, you're not just sitting down at a blank screen to write your initial press statement by committee. You've already written that statement for the media and for the other constituencies you know are going to be affected. Everyone in the organization who needs to see it has seen it and blessed it. Now, when the crisis happens and the pressure is on, you just need to revisit it and tweak it to reflect the exact situation, the fact pattern that you're dealing with right then and there. Everyone needs to glance at it and say, it's good, let's get it out. So you are speeding your communications, and you are taking care of, you're getting most of the critical decisions done about what your posture is going to be, what your approach is, what your organization's mission and values, which are critical touchstones. Don't forget them in a crisis. They are critical touchstones for decision making. What do your mission and values tell you as an organization you should be doing? So the crisis planning process has four components. The first is risk assessment, because you can't manage and mitigate risks you don't know are there and that no one is thinking about. So this is a process that uncovers the full inventory of potential issues to which an organization is exposed and prioritizes them according to the probability and potential for harm. Then we go into, once we know what the risks are and they're prioritized for planning purposes, the planning phase is where we identify the company's crisis team members and assign them clear roles and responsibilities. So everyone knows what their job is in a crisis, and people aren't working at cross purposes and tripping over themselves. And we also, at this point, are assembling really the guts of the plan, the arsenal, the protocols, the tools, the materials that the organization might need to address the identified scenarios. So, at a basic level, this includes things like pre-approved messages and holding statements from media and other audiences, FAQs or Q&As for key stakeholder groups, anticipating the questions they are likely to ask and post about on social media, lists of essential contacts, contact information for third-party experts that for certain issues can amplify and validate your point of view. Very often we create pre-populated web pages, we call them dark sites, that can be tweaked and activated quickly to deliver up-to-date information to stakeholders as a crisis unfolds. And the beauty is, by having this separate page ready to go, we don't have to co-opt the corporate homepage and risk drawing unnecessary attention to whatever the issue is. Testing the plan is absolutely critical, and testing the people who have to implement the plan is critical. So once there's a plan in place, there's a training phase where we put the plan and the people involved, the crisis team, through their paces in responding to a simulated crisis situation. This is where people like me get to have a lot of fun. Because when 60 Minutes shows up on the front lawn of corporate headquarters, it's not a good time to find that you've missed something important in your planning. Trust me, I've seen it. And then the final piece is readiness and surveillance. Because once you have the plan, the process is not over. You now have to be alert. You have to keep the plans up to date, first of all, but you need to be able to intercept and deal with potential problems while they're in their earliest emergence stage before they snowball into an actual crisis. So I like to say that having an effective, well thought out plan is the second best way to manage a crisis. The best way is to keep the crisis from ever happening in the first place. And you do that by doing things to build risk sensitivity into the culture of the organization, making people sensitive to risk and sensitive to the importance of protecting the organization's reputation. And part of that involves empowering people to raise their hands without fear of reprisal if in the course of their day-to-day work they encounter a situation or sense something is happening that could put the organization and reputation and trust of key constituencies in harm's way. So you really need to be deputizing employees at all levels. Not necessarily to respond in the event of a crisis, but everyone needs to know it's their job to raise their hand to sound an alarm if they sense something is amiss, because 90% of crises either emanate from within, they start within the organization because somebody does something, says something, writes something, agrees to something without fully thinking through the dangers, or at the very least, there are signs, there are smoldering fires, there's smoke, there are signs that something potentially is afoot that can be identified and dealt with well before it takes on crisis proportions. But that doesn't happen because everyone says, well, wait, that's not my job. Somebody else has to sound the alarm on that. And if nobody sounds the alarm, that's when organizations find themselves blindsided by crises.
Thank you, John. Very, very helpful guidance in terms of crisis plans. Now, I'd like to shift gears a little bit, move from the external communications that we've been talking about and move more internally and ask Abraham and John, and maybe give John a little bit of a break after providing quite a good explanation of the crisis plan. And maybe Abraham, you could speak to this first. At what point do you bring your own employees? When does trouble bring their own broader staff under the tent, so to speak, and make them aware of the unfolding crisis? And moreover, can you control, and if so, how, what they might do or say publicly?
Sure. So definitely, there are a lot of risks for having sort of in both directions, for having your employees and internal people know too much too soon, and not enough and too late. And there's really a very hard line or a balance that you need to find both from legally and from a communication standpoint and a standpoint I'm sure that John will talk about. So I'll just mention legally, you're going to be bringing in a number of your employees, probably on the higher levels, to talk about what the issue is. To really understand, you're going to have to talk, sort of go down the line in the department and make sure that when you're fully understanding what the issue is and what the crisis is, there are going to be employees that are going to know that there's a crisis. There might be the employee that was the first one to touch base with the various regulatory agency and the email that they may have received that they sort of forwarded along before it got to senior management or even before it got to the legal counsel. Every single person who's sort of touched this crisis so forth, you're going to have to remind them about the company's insider trading policy, and that they are now effectively in blackout if you think this is material, and you're going to have to disclose to the public. You're going to want to maintain that blackout list of all those individuals. So when eventually FINRA or the SEC comes, and if there's going to be a big drop in price of your in your stock price, FINRA will probably come and want to know, well, did any of these individuals or who knew earlier and maybe who traded on that information? And you're not going to want to add another crisis to your hands by having an insider trading problem. However, at some point, you're going to want to sort of make sure that everyone in your company sees this and has the answers. And you're going to probably end up giving a bunch more answers internally than you would give externally. So timing the internal and external communications right and almost simultaneously is very important, so that the employees need to have the answers right away upon seeing the news. But at the same time, we want to, as I mentioned, balance that with making sure that people don't have material non-public information unless they really need to. And I'll sort of let John talk about some of the other aspects of what you might want to consider when letting individuals inside your organization know.
Sure, thanks. You know, the best way to control what employees do and say publicly is to communicate openly and make sure they have the facts at the time they need them, as Avram's last comment confirms. Nothing breaks the trust of employees like hearing critical news about their company, the company they devote their lives to, their families' futures to, their pensions to, if such things exist anymore. Hearing about those things from the media or a neighbor or a competitor, yet before they hear what's happening from their own company. In terms of controlling what employees do and say and how they communicate, good communications hygiene means having policies in place that make clear who is and is not authorized to speak with media on behalf of the company, and makes very clear what constitutes media in this day and age, because it's no longer cut and dried. It should also cover just some basic bullets, tips, what to do and say if an employee picks up their phone and is greeted by a reporter on the other end who's asking questions. How do you safely and easily and benignly handle that inquiry and push them off to the right place? Likewise, what to do and say if an employee is approached by a reporter or news crew as they leave the building, because as we've seen on 60 Minutes and all of the newstainment programs, the ambush of the CEO where he pulls his suit jacket up over his head and runs away is never a good image, no matter what the situation is. Likewise, every company needs to have a social media policy governing what employees may and may not post on personal company and third-party social accounts. And you need to be clear that employees are free to think and say and post what they want, but they're also responsible for making sure that their online activities are professional, tasteful, helpful, and don't reflect in a negative or misleading way on the company or anyone else. I always recommend these policies be part of the employee handbook new employees receive. Make them a part of the code of conduct employees sign at least semi-annually. Employees need to be reminded of these responsibilities and also where they can turn if they have questions about what is or is not appropriate to do or say or reveal or post on social media or anywhere else. And they need to know they can ask those questions before they do anything that can cause themselves or the company irreparable damage.
Thank you, John and Avram. Before we resume with our evolving scenario, let's go now to our second polling question. And just remind everyone that for CLA credit, you're required to complete these. If we can bring up the next polling question. Does your crisis plan or have your crisis responses included communicating with key collaborators, partners, and funders? Yes, no, I don't know. We'll take 20 seconds for everyone to respond. Please submit your answer. We'll give everyone about 5 more seconds. Excellent. Now if we can bring up the results. Okay, well, about half have taken this into account.
It looks like the other 50% need to confirm if it's the case, roughly a third, and then others 15% that their plan does not include provisions for communicating with these stakeholders. Probably a good idea, especially based on guidance from John, that commence quickly. Let's return back to our slides. Great, thank you. And we can go to the next bullet, please. Trouble has now, an additional fact in our scenario, Trouble has secured a loan agreement, which it treats as a material agreement per SEC purposes, with BioCash, a lender with a large portfolio of biotech borrowers. The loan agreement has detailed notice requirements, covenants, and events of defaults. Don, how should Trouble communicate with its lender in this case?
Mark, thanks for asking. If we think about kind of bet the company, very important, collaboration agreements, loan agreements, and so on, right? These are important relationships, and the documents, the agreements are important. With key counterparties, they have typically extensive obligations. Mark, you mentioned, extensive notice requirements, a potential, a long list of covenants and events of default. And so, you're facing a crisis already. How are you going to maneuver with your key counterparties, such as a lender, to make sure you don't have a house of cards falling in on you scenario that, everything starts to topple, right? So I think first you want to know your documents. What do they require? Do they require notice of a recall event or something like this? Is there a material adverse change clause in your loan agreement that would trigger an event of default because of this? Ideally, when you're thinking about these important documents, drafting them is the moment of maximum leverage, right? To think about a potential crisis in advance and try to build in and allow your company, your organization, to have the flexibility to work through such a crisis and not have a counterparty be able to take extreme action without you getting the chance to do so. Second, I think, Mark, as we've talked about in other venues and with other stakeholders, the care and feeding of these relationships is very important, right? You don't want to sign a loan agreement or collaboration agreement, put it on the shelf, not talk to your key contacts at that organization until the first time they hear from you is, we've got a terrible problem now, right? So if you can keep those partners, close. I mean, everybody kind of wants to be your partner now. That's the marketing lingo you hear all the time. Your lenders want to be your partner and so on. So treat it seriously, right? If you can take advantage of that and try to build a spirit of trust and transparency with your partners as to what's going on, that can make a huge difference, at a moment of crisis when you're asking them to show patience, right? And to trust you that you'll be able to move through to the other side, right? Another thing to think about, again, as I mentioned with, a state regulator, is what does your counterparty in a situation care about? If they're a lender, maybe their focus is on your cash position and your cash flow. So if you can proactively address that and think about, what you're going to be able to say to them when you get on the phone and they ask those questions, which you can anticipate, right? As opposed to, I don't know, or, we're just not sure, or no comment, right? That's important as well. Ideally, a best practice for these types of key documents, like a loan agreement or collaboration agreement, is to have, a summary of the key obligations under those agreements at the hand and ready, and someone familiar with those, so that, built into your crisis response or crisis plan is, hey, what are the implications here for these key relationships? What are the specific requirements, but also, do we have, the relationships and the foundation with these counterparties that we can maintain their trust, as we move through the crisis.
Great, thank you, Don. And if we could advance the slide, please, to the next bullet. Great, thank you. And, we've talked about a lot of stakeholders and external parties that a company like Trouble would be communicating to, and now we're expanding that. We know that Trouble is very involved in patient advocacy and also has close relationships with key opinion leaders relevant to the product and disease states it's involved in. And I'll turn to John. How and when should Trouble communicate with these stakeholders, and what would the message be?
Your perceptions in the marketplace in this kind of situation are very much set not by the regulators, not by your counterparties, not by your insurers, but the people who ultimately use and benefit and prescribe your products, the KOLs and the patients. So this is, organizations say, oh, well, compared to the FDA or the EMA, we know our employees. This is a piece of cake. Not true. You have to tread very carefully. Your stakeholders all have different expectations of you in a crisis. They want to see and hear you do certain things that align with what is important to them. Your investors, unless they're also patients, don't care that you're doing a good job communicating with employees. They don't care that you're doing a good job communicating with your customers. They care that you're dealing with the issue to keep the stock price up. Your patients want to know different things, but it's important to remember, they all expect different things. They want to see and hear you do different things, but all your stakeholders have one expectation in common. They expect you to care. You need to demonstrate, they expect to see you demonstrate that you care, that you're dealing with the situation correctly, that you're doing so with responsibility and integrity. Because ultimately, it's not the crisis itself that does lasting harm to reputation and corporate value, but it's how the organization is seen responding to it. And the number one cause of harm in a crisis is the perception that the organization just doesn't care. So patients expect you to address their fears that the crisis could prevent them from getting their meds, that it's going to drive up costs, that in this scenario, their safety may have taken a backseat to profits. Physicians want to know that they can trust what you say and what you are saying and vouch for you with their patients, because your crisis potentially puts their patients' trust and confidence in them for prescribing the med, puts their patients' trust and confidence on the line. Patients aren't getting their news from the same places. They're sharing information. They're spreading what they hear. They're perpetuating rumors on social media, in online forums, on Twitter, in groups run by disease advocacy groups. So you need to know what their trusted sources of information and insight are in advance and how to reach them. You need to build the necessary relationships, and this goes to something both Don and Avraham have said in their past responses. You need to build the relationships and establish trust before you have a crisis. You need to make friends essentially before you need them. And if you engage openly with patients and advocates in those communications channels that you've identified in ways that benefit and support them, when they see that your only motivation is to be helpful, in other words, before you have a crisis, they're much likely to listen to you and take you for your word when things are hitting the fan. So building those relationships up front, demonstrating who you are, what you're all about, what you stand for, that you care about how you're perceived, you care to be helpful to your constituents, that goes a tremendous way when things go off the rails.
Thank you, John.
And if we can bring up actually the last wrinkle in our scenario with trouble, that'd be great. So here we see that our besieged company Trouble has stock throughput insurance covering raw material, semi-finished and finished product, directors and officers coverage, and other industry standard insurance coverages. Don, can you give us your thoughts on this insurance angle?
Thanks, Mark. I'm happy to address insurance issues. I actually have been procuring insurance for my company for 15 years. So let's start with D&O insurance, and this is going to very much dovetail with Abraham's thoughts about as a securities lawyer, right? you can protect yourself from this type of a crisis in terms of a securities class action claim, right, which is where D&O Insurance responds, with a smart disclosure process, including a committee with an insider trading policy to defend against allegations of insider trading and so on and so forth. So, that's kind of in the D&O area, you want to have those types of structures in place, just as Avraham would advise, right? In general, with stock throughput coverage, for example, which might cover the loss of product, okay, you want to have an open, a culture of open communication within your company and across your supply chain, so that small problems in the supply chain, or even big ones, are disclosed and addressed early on, right? So for a couple of reasons, right? So one is almost every insurance policy there, or even under the background applicable law, there's a duty to mitigate. If you're going to have a loss, right, have you made every effort you can to limit the extent of that loss? And so if you have a potential smoldering fire, as John put it, with your supply chain, do your employees know to raise those issues and not just kind of ignore them until it becomes a huge flame, right? The second aspect of it is, if you have some small issues which become a big one much later, and you go to make a claim with your insurance carrier, one of the things they're going to ask is, what did you know and when did you know it, right? And so it's important that if they felt that there could have been any action taken to mitigate that and it was, their view is reasonable, that was actually done. Another thing I would say about it in the insurance area is you've got to be very wary of your insurance applications, right? Folks, may not pay so much attention to these, but they often have a lot of questions you have to answer on an annual basis. And when you have a claim, especially if it's sizable, your insurance carrier is going to pull up two documents. They're going to pull up the insurance policy, and they're going to pull up your insurance application, right? And so the policy is the contract that sets forth the limits of coverage, and the application is all filled with certifications that your company has made. And so if, for example, the company has had minor or small losses at this plant in, the third-party manufacturing plant in Asia, and just kind of someone at the company has handled those without raising them or bringing them to the insurance carrier, and any of those problems kind of would have foreshadowed this larger problem, then the insurance carrier looks at the application. There's a question that says, describe all claims or potential claims in the last 5 years. You've answered none, right? And then the carrier says, wait a second, we understand from this report that there were 3 issues in the past 4 years. And you say, but those were tiny issues, they were not significant. And the carrier says, we needed to know those. That was, you answered a false question on your application. That would have affected how we underwrote the risk, how much premium we charged, whether we covered the risk, and we would have required mitigation efforts long before this problem blew up into the huge loss that it is, right? So insurance applications often don't get a lot of attention. They should. And finally, in your communications with your insurance carriers, you want to be guided by the contract and the application. Communicate what is required in that application or otherwise, not more and not less, right? This is about knowing your obligations again. And you may want to consider for some types of small losses, and before we had the larger scenario of the FDA recall, some losses can be handled commercially, and you don't need to go to your insurance carrier to claim for a formal claim. And that can be handled, if you have a manufacturing partner who's made a mistake, you can have a pricing adjustment or otherwise, and they don't necessarily need to be handled through insurance. Now, again, you've got to weigh that with the requirement to disclose what has to be disclosed under your certifications and insurance policy. So there's a lot to think about in the insurance world when it comes to these types of events, and you want to make sure someone is thinking about it. It's easy to forget this in the time for crisis, but they are a key constituent, a key stakeholder in your business. Thanks, Mark.
Great, thanks, Don, and thanks for providing that bit of information on an aspect quite frankly, crisis management that I certainly was not aware of before this. So it's very information for me at the very least. Now I'd like us to move to, before we go to Linda and the panelists, and Linda will provide a wrap up, we're going to go to our third and final polling question. And again, just a reminder that this is a requirement to complete this for CLE credit. So if we can please move to the question, that would be great. Who is ultimately responsible for protecting the reputation of a company? Is it the C-suite, the board of directors, corporate communications function, legal, or everyone? We'll take 20 seconds for everyone to apply. Give everyone about 5 more seconds. Great, now let's move to our responses. All right, excellent. So no homework. Everybody got the right answer.
Everyone was listening.
Yes, perfect. See, there has been progression through each of the questions, and this was 100% accuracy. It is everyone's, and I think that was highlighted in comments from our panel today, and certainly in a lot of what John brought up in terms of responsibility within a company. So with that being said, I would like to hand it over to my co-chair and co-moderator, Linda, to provide her wrap up and overview, and then get some final thoughts from the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So when Don raised this idea at our advisory committee meeting, there was immediate interest, and I want to thank him for pulling together a great scenario and a great program, and also for recruiting Abraham to our panel. And also a special thanks to our committee member, Jean Friedman, for her help in recruiting John. When this topic was proposed, it was January, well before most of us in the US had any idea about the COVID-19 pandemic that we now face. This event that we are now living through heightens the importance of being ready. Who could imagine some of the things we have seen, COVID-induced manufacturing plant issues, product shortages, executives from a biotech company, all at an event where a huge COVID-19 outbreak occurs. My 14-year-old daughter has a great melody that she plays on the piano, and I asked her the name of it, and she said it's Black Swan. And frankly, I had not really heard that term before she started playing this song, but I've now come to more fully appreciate what a Black Swan event is. It is an event that is unpredictable beyond what is normally expected and has potentially severe consequences. We now face one today. So let's look at the remarks shared by our panelists. We would have named our program "An Ounce of Prevention is Worth a Pound of Cure," perhaps, because certainly being ready is a key point, and having preparations before crisis hits is one of the most important takeaways that we've seen. As a former litigator, I worked on the diet drug fen-phen cases and saw firsthand how challenging it is to manage perceptions and also demonstrate a good faith effort to take action in that instance when safety risks exist for a product that was supposed to provide medical benefits. Some of the comments that we heard were John saying, a crisis plan gives you a running head start. And I do think everyone, as was pointed out today, needs to know their responsibility to sound an alarm so that the organization can take prompt action. Stated another way, each person in an organization needs to know that they can and need to be the canary in the coal mine who can help avert disaster, or at least aid the company in acting promptly to address and responsibly manage the situation. Certainly, managing reputational risk is also critical. It's important that we ensure reliable information, but as we heard, the tension between the interest in over-communication by those in corporate communications and those of us in legal who want to exercise caution in what we say and when we say it is never going to go away. That tension is there. But no comment we heard can be viewed as an admission of guilt. And we heard that the most important thing is really to say what we know, even if the answer for the moment is we don't know at this time, but we are taking action to obtain the information we need to respond responsibly. Don shared in his initial vision for this program the many groups who are stakeholders whose expectations must be considered. These include employees who are better to hear it from the company than the media in terms of these significant events that can affect our company's progress. We also heard insurance companies, FDA, SEC, sales reps, physicians, patients, investors, the public, the media, company leadership, including the board of directors, affiliates, and licensees, even those that are overseas. I think Abraham's comment is also extremely important. We face a tough critic because when our comments are viewed later, they will be viewed through a lens of what is known at that later point in time. Finally, most importantly, we need to focus on building relationships of trust with these many stakeholders before we need to reach out to them when crisis hits. It is essential to invest in these relationships beforehand. Now let's turn to the panelists for their final takeaways, and we'll start with Abraham.
Thank you, Linda. So, I mean, I really think, and for most of my comments, the takeaways that I really want people to get from this panel or from some of my comments are really twofold. One of them, which has been mentioned by John and Don and Linda even recently, you need to make and maintain relationships with all your key internal and external collaborators in advance. And this is not necessarily all the stakeholders, but all the people who are going to be on that crisis management team, or you're going to call in at the time of crisis to discuss. Especially, as John mentioned, not everyone looks at legal favorably, and only at times call legal in when there's a crisis. But when there's a crisis is not the time that you want to be introducing yourself to a key collaborator for the first time. If you can't go speak to the head of somebody of a department in your company and you're only speaking to them and introducing yourself to them at the first time of a crisis, that's probably not going to go over well, and you're not going to be on the same page for the company's risk tolerance and how disclosure should be run. And that goes for also discuss, the key individuals outside at the FDA or at the regulatory agency or at the SEC or NASDAQ or at any of your outside counsel. When you need to call them and you have an hour to get that press release ready, you want to make sure that they see when Avram Adler is calling me on my cell phone that they're going to pick up, because they know that it's important and they know who you are, and that this is something that they're going to need to deal with because you've made and maintained that relationship already. And secondly, as John said, oftentimes you should have prepared for this crisis already, and you'll have seen maybe sometimes those cracks in the armor, those chinks leading up to the initial crisis that could be averted. And that's also in terms of understanding risk in your organization. Hopefully quarterly and annually, when you're reviewing your company's risk factors and discussing things that may happen and trigger points, maybe maybe nobody saw COVID-19 coming, but there are a lot of other things that people have discussed and have seen coming that the company and those determining how to disclose such issues are really 75% there, that another scenario was similar enough that you could now discuss it and decide, well, this is what we have to do, and these are the other things that we can discuss or we have to be concerned about when disclosing. So hopefully that will guide everyone should they see an issue or something that needs to a similar scenario in their own company in the future. Thank you, Linda.
Just to add my parting comments. First, if you leave this webinar a bit uncomfortable or maybe a lot uncomfortable about whether your organization is ready to successfully weather the kind of scenario we just laid out and come out of it with reputation, trust, and your collective stomach linings intact, then I'm happy to say we've done our job. To go to something that Avraham just said about looking forward, understanding, nobody anticipated, nobody expected a global COVID-19 pandemic to erupt as it has over the last 3 months. And I get a lot of calls. I'm speaking to a lot of organizations about, well, what do we need to do to our crisis plan so that doesn't happen again? And it's not a matter of creating a longer crisis plan to address the things that companies missed with COVID-19 or a pandemic scenario the first time. Because, Avram is right, nobody, at least nobody in the corporate world, really saw it coming with the speed and magnitude that it did. But if you look at it, what was very apparent, what should have been readily apparent, are all of the underlying issues that caught companies short. Brittle supply chains, lack of redundancy in operations and call centers and back office systems, in countries where that were shut down early. The shutdown of transportation and how that affected the flow of goods and raw materials and people. The lack of robust work from home and technology policies to assure that if your offices are not accessible or can't be used, business goes on. All of these things were foreseeable. These are things that are all part of a good crisis plan. So I tell organizations, yes, you need to be thinking about how to update your crisis plan to reflect what we're going through now. But more importantly, go back to your organization and look, where can we immunize against future crises? Where can we take steps to create redundancy or add a new supplier to our supply chain, to update our technology and employee policies, to effectively inoculate against future crises and keep those crises as much as you can from ever occurring. So it's not just about planning now. Organizations need to think about how to immunize themselves against crisis by identifying the underlying risks and taking steps to address them. Whether you're an early stage company or more established, if from where you sit, you're not aware of what the crisis plan is or who's responsible for it, you need to ask the question. You need to make sure that the regulatory and compliance functions are properly represented on the crisis team. If you're one of the organizations that doesn't have a crisis in place, I encourage you to sound that alarm. Make sure the process starts. And if there's resistance to doing it company-wide at the start, then at least bring the right people together within your organization, within your department, to think through and create plans for the situations and crises that are within your purview. You're much better off having at least thought through a rudimentary plan and the questions that need to be asked and who needs to be involved in a crisis than be caught without a plan at all. And my co-panelists laughed at this when I said it yesterday. You buy a plunger before you need a plunger. I would bet everyone on this call today at home owns a toilet plunger, and crisis plans and plumber's helpers have a lot in common. You hope you never need either of them, but they're worth the investment to keep you out of deep you-know-what. And finally, BioNJ has generously asked me if I would share some additional information, insights, crisis readiness, and crisis planning tools that might be helpful. So those are going to go out after this session. So you can look forward to those. If you have questions after the call or after receiving them, or if you have a specific concern that you'd like to discuss, not in front of a large televised audience, goes without saying, I'm more than happy to speak with anyone offline and in total confidence. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, John. Thanks again to Mark and Linda for your work here as moderators. and to my co-panelists and to BioNJ. My takeaways for the day. Number one, read and know and understand your documents and your obligations. You know, your key agreements, your regulatory applications, your insurance applications. Take those, you know what they say, take them seriously when they are initially done, and know what your going forward obligations are in them. Number two, anticipate what your stakeholders are going to care about in a given crisis, right? And in crafting your messaging and your interactions with them, address their concerns in a proactive way, right? So that they know, they think that partly that your response is very much tailored toward them, as if they're the only one in the room, right? And maybe my third takeaway is, here's my prop for the day. If you can see this, you don't want to be this guy, right? The runner of the month runner-up for the employee of the month. You want to be a leader, okay? And so consider how you can lead in your organization, as John was saying, to move the needle forward in this area. So if there's no crisis plan in place, get on the team and start ring the bell to have one. If there's one on an old shelf that hasn't been updated, that no one's aware of, that no one's been trained on, that no one's practiced, then maybe you can, take the reins there and try to get those things done so that it's actually a useful document when the time comes. And a third, feel free to reach out to professionals like John, who can, come in and educate your teams about the benefits of, crisis preparedness and, the importance of spending a bit of effort and time up front, and how much better that is than to be caught, flat-footed at the worst possible moment. So that's it. Thanks, Linda.
Well, I'll take it from here. We have a few minutes left before we wrap up, and we did get some questions, and I appreciate the audience's engagement throughout this conference, throughout this program, and also the questions you've submitted. So we'll try to maybe get at least one, if not more, another one in before we start to wrap up here. I'll throw one out to the group here that came in online. Do you suggest putting a communications into the hands of your field-based folks, your sales reps, so to speak, or calling on, or maybe now remotely calling on HCPs, and who might anticipate a lot of questions coming through that route? So Brett, I don't know if John wants to weigh in, or
yeah, absolutely. Again, the more people you have who have the correct information in your field force, on your sales force, because they're going to get questions whether you want them to or not. So make sure they have the right answers. And they also play a very essential role, and that is as a barometer of sentiment, and be able to take the temperature and feed back up the chain what HCPs and customers are telling them, what they're hearing in the market. Your field force is a vital delivery mechanism for information, but they're also a vital source of intel to guide your messaging and your communications efforts. Because if you're messaging a particular issue and it's clear from what's coming back that it's being interpreted in an unintended way, that gives you the opportunity to course correct and fix that and address it in real time directly to the audiences who need it. So thanks for whoever asked that question. Yes, it's absolutely essential.
And Mark, can I add one point here, which is that, there's an opportunity to create a document of key messages, right, and messaging in a situation like this that can be shared more widely. So that empowers people throughout your organization to have something to say and not be flat-footed when the questions come in, or if they even want to proactively address the issue where they think it's appropriate.
Great, thank you. And I don't know if we can get a really short answer to this question, which I find very interesting, either Don or Abraham. What's the current state of social media policies as it relates to, avoiding the chilling of an employee's right to speak about working conditions in view of the National Labor Relations Board? I don't know if that's a short answer before we wrap up.
I don't have visibility into that. Do either of you guys?
It is an issue. It comes up fairly frequently. And as I said in one of my earlier answers about social media policy, you have to be able to make clear that you are not dictating or not abridging an employee's right to speak, right to speech, and to communicate, but that there are expectations for regulatory and other reasons to which they will be held. The issue comes in an organized labor situation. Anything that is perceived as potentially chilling protected employee communications, protected employee speech, will create problems with the NLRB and and any unions with representation in your company. But your labor lawyers know what those parameters and guidelines are and should be able to guide you accordingly.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. And I think we'll, before I turn it over to Debbie for closing remarks, I would just like to thank the panelists, my co-chair, Linda, and all at BioNJ who made this possible. Thank you very much also to the audience for your participation and question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and also, thank you to all of our speakers, to Linda, to Mark, to Abraham, Don, and John for sharing your time and your expertise and your support. Really invaluable, scary, as you said, John, but invaluable and important. So we are honored to have all of these folks as members of BioNJ, Buchanan, Ingersoll, and Rooney, PTC Therapeutics, and Sanofi, and very much appreciate your support. Thank you all for joining us. I do hope it was informative. We will be emailing all of you your CLE certificates, as a follow-up. If you're interested in learning more about BioNJ or perhaps sponsoring a webinar such as this on an important topic, please contact Kim Minton. We would love to have you. We have a couple key webinars coming up. The value of medical innovation in the age of COVID-19, ensuring future cures and protecting patient access on June 3rd. We have Jersey Meets Jerusalem, COVID-19 research featuring Dr. Saul Baer of Teva on June 1st, and also our COVID-19 research showcase featuring 10 companies on June 5th. So I hope you'll be able to join us for some of them. Meanwhile, most importantly, I hope that everyone stays safe and well, and that we will see you in real time, in person, very, very soon. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.